We last spoke to Stephen Mansfield about his book, The Miracle of the Kurds, a remarkable story of hope reborn in northern Iraq. Today he's joining us about a different book he's authored, Ask the Question, Why We Must Demand Religious Clarity from Our Presidential Candidates. Stephen, it's great to talk to you as always. I think before we even get into the meat of the argument, I want to go over some of the material in the book. Your book suggests that many Americans maybe are not willing enough to demand what you describe as religious clarity. And I don't know that I agree. I mean, hasn't religion been an important factor in elections for a long time? When I think about the Democratic side, this year is the first time I remember not hearing the question, what's your favorite religious verse? It seems people have been very willing to demand those answers.
Well, we've had more discussion of religion because we've had candidates who are more outspoken about religion. Barack Obama, very outspoken, Hillary Clinton. But my point is, once a candidate puts their religion in play, we should know more specifically what that means. A classic example right now would be Donald Trump. It's very clear that religion's not his first language, and so we should be pressing in a little bit more. What does it mean that you're a Presbyterian? What are the implications of your faith for specific policy areas? And of course, the same thing with the Barack Obamas and Hillary Clintons and people on the other side. So I'm not looking just for general airing and discussion of faith. I'm looking for both the press and the voters to press in a little bit more into the views of the candidates and understand what they are.
So before we get into some of those more specific questions that you would like to see asked, and many of them are very, very interesting and they're not being asked, you do describe our present time as a religious one rather than a secular one. And I'd love to dig into more what you mean by that, because all studies seem to suggest sort of the opposite, that this is the most secular time in American history. People are moving away from religion more quickly than ever. We've got the Pew Research Center study, which shows that belief in God, church attendance, and belief that religion is important are declining more rapidly than ever. So isn't this really one of the least religious times in history?
Well, no, I don't believe it is. And I think the stats bear that out. People may be disassociating a bit from formal institutions of faith. There may be less church attendance. We may have a rise of the nuns, the NONES, who can't check on a form, that they're part of any traditional religion. However, I don't think faith is going away in general. I think people are as quote unquote spiritual or as religious as ever. And certainly what fills the headlines is related to faith. Look at all the shootings of late. Orlando here recently, definitely a faith-oriented in some way event. The rise of ISIS, the issues of Buddhism, just all over the world. You have very much faith-oriented issues, violence, contests filling the headlines.
But doesn't that mean, Stephen, I mean, you're sort of pointing to individual instances where one's religion played a role in the actions they chose to take sort of in the real world, but I'm not seeing any broad indicators, right? How important do you believe religion is in life? How often do you even pray? Some of these questions aren't even related to just church attendance.
Well, you're absolutely right. I think church attendance, without question, is in decline in America. But for example, I think there's a misunderstanding of what the nuns are for the most part. The millennials, for example, I spend a lot of time on college campuses. Ask the millennials if they pray, you may not get as high an answer as if you ask them if they talk to God, quote unquote, or if they meditate. So I'm not trying to make a case that we're in some religious renewal worldwide.
Yeah.
I'm just simply saying it's as important, I think, as ever. And given the fact that we're dealing with radical Islam, other issues like that in our headlines so much, it may in some sense be more important, and that at a time when Americans are not really equipped to understand those issues.
So I totally understand, as you say, once a candidate sort of makes a declaration about their religion, I understand wanting to know, well, how does that correlate or impact with their political beliefs? What policy ideas would they put forward that are related to their religious beliefs? But at the same time, wouldn't we be in a better place if religion was not a factor when we talk about evaluating candidates? We do have ostensibly separation of church and state, and I know that you address the idea. You do say It's just not private anymore. The idea that it can be private is just not realistic. But might we not be better off if religion was not part of a campaign?
Well, maybe, but and I say this kindly, good luck in removing religion from the lives of the candidates. You have to understand, and I'm not saying in this in any way contentiously. I'm not insisting that they put religion in play. They're bringing it up. They're saying they're faith-based. They're saying they'll do the will of Jesus Christ in office.
Right.
They're saying that they're social gospel Methodists. So once a candidate puts anything in play, a club membership, a third marriage, imagine what would happen if we found out Donald Trump was a member of a golf club that had once not allowed blacks. Absolutely, we would consider that in play. So once a candidate says, my politics grow organically from my faith, it's absolutely something we need to understand. The opposite, the thing you posit, I'm fine with. Let's keep religion completely out of the public sphere. It's just not going to happen. So let's be sophisticated in dealing with it. That's my contention.
And along those lines, in what ways are the questions about religion asked by media? And you talk mostly about sort of the corporate media discussion of religion in the book. What types of questions would we be better served to hear from those in the media about a candidate's religion?
Well, for example, let's take Hillary Clinton, whom I believe is one of the most faith-based candidates or politicians of our generation. She has said, for example, that her view of immigration grows organically from her faith. In speeches on the floor of the U.S. Senate, she took Republicans very much to task based on the ethics of Jesus, and quite frankly, a fine speech. Well, if I'm going to consider voting for her, don't I need to understand the faith basis of her immigration policy, given that she said it was faith-based? Again, not to attack her, not to be bombastic, but to simply understand the full of who she is as a candidate and what she'll do in office. If her views of abortion are faith-based, if her views of same-sex marriage are faith-based, and she says they are, then I simply want to understand that as a candidate. I decry attacking candidates for their religion, but I want to understand it in the same way that I might want to understand their theories about the First Amendment or private property law. It's simply understanding the candidate in full.
And how is media getting it wrong when they talk to candidates about religion? You talk about this in the book.
The media, although they're getting better, tends to deal with religion as though it was like a wart on a candidate's nose, an oddity, this strange thing that's over here on the side of their life. Now that's changing, and I don't mean to be generalizing, but most of the time when I hear the media asking questions, they ask questions about a candidate's religion again as though it's some odd growth on their life, on their otherwise normal life. When the candidates themselves often say, particularly in this presidential race, the candidates themselves often say that their politics are a product of their faith, a product of their, let's call it a religious vision. That's definitely the case with most of those who ran for office on the Republican side, and it's certainly the case with Mrs. Clinton, Senator Clinton. So all of that to say that this is just simply understanding what they themselves are claiming about themselves.
I don't disagree with you that I would love to see more clarity on a lot of these sort of general statements about religion that we hear from candidates. At the same time, I feel like we would only be best served by that if there was some sort of very clear understanding that we do have presumably separation of church and state, and that religious ideas should sort of be separate from how civil government operates. And I just am not, whenever we do see questions about religion, that narrative, that sort of reality seems to be missing. And I think it's actually a disservice to voters, and that voters increasingly get sort of confused, or at least aren't being, they're not hearing discussions of, wait, so in spite of the fact that your religion might inspire, right? If they ask the Stephen Mansfield recommended question, which is, okay, you say your view on X issue is inspired by your religion. Now we understand that. Now, given that we presumably have separation of church and state, how will you separate the two? And that seems like a much harder ask.
And I think that certainly is the follow-on question. But the reality is, it's my view that as long as you have human beings in public office, you're going to have religion, being a factor. It's not that I'm arguing for it. I'm saying it is already there. Let's make sure we understand it before it gets there. Then, if we do ask the questions that I'm recommending, I think absolutely the follow-on question ought to be, so how will you observe the separation of church and state? For example, and again, I'm not in any way being bombastic, I'm not giving my personal views. Barack Obama came into the presidency opposed to same-sex marriage, then reversed himself, his words, not mine, based on his reading of the New Testament. Now, if I was a thoroughgoing secularist, that would concern me. How does the separation of church and state play in there? This was a major policy shift on his part. So again, I'm not going after him. I'm saying here's a classic example where understanding that religion does and will shape the person in office, and then secondarily, that the separation of church and state is not the same thing as the separation of individual religion from individual beliefs about politics. And we see that in the life of almost every candidate.
I'll remind you, we've been speaking about the book Ask the Question, Why We Must Demand Religious Clarity from Our Presidential Candidates. We've been speaking with the book's author, Stephen Mansfield. Stephen, always great to talk to you.
Oh, it's wonderful to talk to you. I really appreciate your insightful questions.